Alrighty, everybody. It's just another Kill Team. Travis here for the Sanctifiers review. Jason is doing his half with the Goremongers, which you can check out in another video on the channel. However, we'll be talking about the Sanctifiers today, bringing ecclesiarchal justice to those who feign against the God Emperor's enemies. We got 10 operatives plus the cherub. The cherub you always have to take, the confessor you always take, and then you get 9 other guys. Everyone is roughly a human with 4s to hit on melee, 5 up save, 7 wounds, with some exceptions, and all of our shooting weapons being 2s to hit. And those 7 wounds are going to feel like 9 wounds because you have the Sermon faction ability. So at the beginning of the game, you will pick your leader to create a 6-inch bubble of -1 normal damage and critical damage for 3 damage or higher. When your operatives start in Sermon, they finish their activation in Sermon. So you can send off your melee specialist into enemy lines away from the Sermon with the -1 normal damage and crit damage for their entire activation, which will make some of our melee specialists definitely perform a lot better than 9 wounds. Luckily, because of our Confessor's special ability, Lead the Procession, we can generally expect about 12 inches of movement a turn, which is obviously a kind of insane number from a standard 2 APL operative. With only 6 inches range, most of our flamers are only going to be able to output close up to your opponents. However, most of them hit on 2s, and if you land a critical hit, you drop a blaze token on an opponent. Blaze tokens generally incur always D3 damage, and they could incur a little bit more, but your opponent gets a choice on whether or not they take a 66% gamble to put out the fires naturally, or they use an APL to guarantee that the fire goes out. The Sanctifier Confessor is the star of the show. He's got 10 wounds, a big bonk stick, and he's got 2 super important abilities. First up, Lead the Procession. When your operative activates your Confessor, you select if you're going to do Lead the Procession or not. There's no turn limit. There's no timing limit. So after he's done, everybody within range of your Sermon gets a free reposition, charge, or fallback. This includes activated models and unactivated models, which means that you can do some truly insane stuff, especially because the charge action, you can also flip from conceal to engage to go do it. So you can creep up, hit the Sermon, have the Confessor, switch all of your operatives that are close up, hit charges on the opposite side of the board. Defensively, he's got the Commanding Declamation. Well, it says you roll off against an opponent's APL when they are within 6 inches of the Confessor. Once a game, when it goes off, that opponent's action is just straight up canceled, which means that the Confessor is kind of hard to tango with in melee range. He's not a slouch either. He's got 4 attacks on 3s, 5/5, brutal, and shock, which means that he can generally tango with most things, including and up to Marines. Those 10 wounds are going to be really important because if you keep those wounds, you get extra CP, which we'll talk about in the equipment area. Next up, our next most important is going to be our pair of Sanctifier missionaries. They've got a flamer and a specialist weapon. I think you're probably going to end up taking both of them all the time. You can either take a Melta or a Plasma, and then you can take a flamer. The important thing is whether or not you take a Holy Relic on your operative. Now, the Plasma gun cannot take the Holy Relic. And one of the flamers, if you take the Holy Relic, you give up one of your alternate melee weapons. The Holy Relic, though, does provide Sermon, which you can kind of understand as -1 damage flat, along with a bunch of your other ploys triggering automatically. The Brazier of Holy Fire is limited to 1 a kill team, and it effectively works like a short-range flamer or a pretty solid defensive melee weapon because it's got 4 dice on 4s, 4/4, shock, and blaze, which means that if your opponent goes into one of your shooters and you get reasonably lucky on your Brazier of Holy Fire, you can really output a lot of damage. The Melta Missionary, though, is one to call out. Comes with Holy Relic, a Melta Gun, and a Chainsword, which means that while he hits on 4s at all ranges, he does have a lot of output. And if he holds a 3rd APL, he can really get out to some crazy stuff because a Melta Gun is even better when you're guaranteed severe. So if you send either of your missionaries more than 6 inches away from your friendly operatives, they get severe, which means that your flamers automatically hit their blaze, and the Melta Gun automatically hits the Mortal Wounds 4. So there's some pretty powerful stuff over here. We got the Sanctifier Death Cult Assassin up next. He's probably going to be sitting around the Confessor most of the time as a bodyguard. It's got 3 APL, and the Unwavering Devotion firefight ploy is the ability for the Death Cult Assassin to jump within 3 inches range of the Confessor or Miraculous, and I suspect the Death Cult Assassin is generally going to be doing it because while he only has 4 attacks and he hits on 2s, he doesn't have lethal 5, he doesn't have ceaseless, but he does go to parry first, which means backed up by the Sermon on those 8 wounds, it's generally going to be pretty hard to kill a Death Cult Assassin in any one single fight step. Meanwhile, in the range department, he's got throwing knives and 3 APL, which means that he can run ahead, throw knives at people, or just do objectives. And speaking of the Miraculous, we've got the Sanctifier Miraculous, the holy lady of the team. She's got 3 separate limited attacks, which means that she's got an 8-inch range attack, she's got a melee shooting attack, and then she's got a single blazing hand attack in melee. She also has Resurrection on Death, so there is a little bit of a bait where the first time she dies, she reses back at 1 wound and immediately takes a fallback or a dash and ends the melee step or the shooting sequence that she's associated with. That means she's pretty good bait. She's got a 4-up save, which is better than everyone else, and you can push it to a 3-up save with a Salvationist, and a 2-up save if you're behind a portable barricade. Wreath and Fire is effectively a bomb squig explosion. However, it doesn't hit the Miraculous. So you just run around, light yourself on fire, and especially on In the Dark, where the Blast 1 turns into Lethal 5, that blaze in control range definitely leads to the Miraculous probably being a very, very good door defender. Next up, as far as important operatives that may kind of be hidden in the weeds, we get up to 4 Sanctifier Preachers. The Sanctifier Preachers are more generic operatives. We're allowed up to 4 of them, which is notable because on teams like the Exaction Squad, we're only allowed up to 4 subductors. It feels like the power level on the operatives is pretty high. And the Preachers get Sermon as long as they're on an objective marker. So you can set up further away from your opponent, but then charge onto an objective marker during your leaders lead the procession melee, which seems pretty powerful. They got a Chainsword and a Flamer. So the Chainsword hits on 4s, the Flamers hit on 2s, and because you can chain activate your charges with your leader's ability, you could probably get multiple Preachers, letting you go from 4s to hit to 3s to hit. And because you can go so far out of the way of your opponent, if you've done some damage, the Redeem Through Fire ploy can make the Blaze tokens really overperform a little bit. Meanwhile, as a purely defensive utility piece, the Sanctifier Salvationist, well, she's a medic. Doesn't quite do the medic thing, though. So all she does is the 2d3 heal within control range. However, she does come back with a conversion field. The conversion field pushes our saves up by 1, so it makes our 5-up saves 4-up saves. With Sermon, it means that we have 4-up saves in Sermon, and we have a ploy that lets us get Ceaseless while we're in Sermon range. So you could have, theoretically, a 4-up save with Ceaseless, -1 damage, and the conversion field reduces piercing. So you can probably make yourself pretty safe against shooting. Unfortunately, there's literally no output as far as melee or anything. So the Salvation is purely a defensive piece that keeps all your things alive, unless take crack grenades. Our Drill Abbot is another 6-inch bubble aura piece. However, his ability is to reduce injury to not a state that matters. And because of Sermon and our conversion field and all these other defensive things, probably going to stay alive, but be injured a lot of the time. So the Sanctifier Drill Abbot does seem to be pretty solid. He's got a Great Hammer, which is 4 dice on 4s, Brutal Shock, which is a solid profile. And because you can get all these extra rules to make your Drill Abbot a little bit more powerful, he's probably, not bad with Ceaseless or Lethal 5. The Null Skull isn't always good, but there are going to be certain matchups where it's going to overperform. Poor Rekka Crew, the same problem that Nemesis Claw have, the Rekka Crew also have, and that's just literally the Drill Abbot existing. No range threat, just like the Salvationist before, but if you take a crack grenade, he can still do some stuff. Meanwhile, the Persecutor, our chainsaw-wielding maniac, he can fight twice as long as he hits the same target, and he's also got a little bit of a flamethrower. So he's a pretty good operative to stand with +1 APL, because then you can charge, fight, shoot, and he's pretty much always going to get the kill, because he's got 2 fight sequences, 4 dice on 4s, Brutal, 5-6, which means he's probably not going to lose, and because he can strike on death, he's actually a fairly good operative to stand in the front line, take a charge, and go out swinging. Our Conflagrator is our dual pistol wielding maniac. Not super good, but because he has a Sanctification Orbs, if he has a 3rd APL, or you do lead the procession to launch him up the board, you can walk up, give something Seek, and then light them on fire. And definitely there are some uses to that. Or you hold them back for the end of the activation or at the end of the turn, and then use your twin pistols to shoot at 2 separate things and put them both on fire. Especially on In the Dark, he's going to way overperform because then all of his profiles have lethal 5, which is another thing he generically has. Meanwhile, our Reliquant is probably our primary operative that we're going to be skipping because +1 APL probably doesn't really matter too much if you're going to be jumping all of your operatives onto your opponent's objectives with Lead the Procession. And he does have the ability to let an operative who is ready, who is getting incapacitated, take 1 more action on the way out. So if you were playing in a meta where there was more shooting, maybe the Reliquant would make sense. However, I don't think that's really where we are between Felgor and all the other melee stuff. So the Reliquant is cute, but probably not as good. He does have access to the Flamer, and the Flamer is fine, but no melee actions really to speak of on him, which means that he does seem kind of like a letdown compared to some of the other operatives. Meanwhile, as far as strategic ploys go, you got a doozy of them. The Emperor protects. As long as you're in Sermon, you also have Ceaseless while defending, which means that if you have a Salvationist, you're staving on 4s, you get Ceaseless. That means the 1, 2s, and 3s you get to reroll. Probably expecting about 2 to 3 dice. And if you're also going to use cover, you're probably expecting 2 to 3 saves, which is going to make you pretty hard to kill in any one shooting sequence. Pretty useful. Yeah, especially with the Salvationist 6-inch conversion field. Meanwhile, Fervent Brawl, all of your operatives in Sermon have Ceaseless. This one seems like a no-brainer because some percentage of the time you're going to be charging during your leader's Lead the Procession ability. Having free Ceaseless definitely seems good. And when you get charged, as long as you're in Sermon, you get Ceaseless. Pretty good. Zealous Persecution is when you are on an activation where you have charge, your melee weapons get lethal 5. This is pretty good if you're going to be on the aggression. However, if you ever plan to have Lead the Procession from your leader charge, then this is not going to trigger. So this is really going to be useful when you use your leader up front to launch all of your operatives into charge range, and then lethal 5 charge Ceaseless means that all of your dudes are going to strike way above their power level. Meanwhile, Rally the Flock is our last ploy. It's pretty good. It's a pivot piece. So every operative in Sermon range can take a dash or fallback action. And because it's in strat ploy movement phase, it's pretty powerful. However, you do need to end closer to the Orator. So basically this withdraws your pieces, or if your opponent is trying to trap you in melee, you get a chance to run away. It's pretty good. You just can't use it on turning point 1. So no big alpha strikes with an extra 3 inches. Still not really a big deal. Rally the Flock is pretty powerful. Firefight ploys. We've got a good number of them, but because all of them are pretty useful, we'll probably use a lot of CP. Rosarius makes its return as just a scratch, or any of these dodge 1 normal attack dice a turn. It's not going to be always usable because some people, Eldar specifically, will have lethal 5, so maybe less useful there. However, the ability to just have reduced normal attack dice once means that between Sermon and your Ceaseless and all this other stuff, your 7 wound operatives are going to feel way more like 9, 12 wound operatives, which is really nice. Ardent Eradication, you get Relentless if you're shooting or fighting, as long as your opponent is in your Orator's Sermon range, which is either going to be 3 inches for non-Confessor or 6 inches. Oh boy. Relentless Melt-A-Guns, Relentless Plasma Guns, Relentless Crack Grenades. There's so many different things that you can make Relentless, and that does read very powerful, especially when you're trying to push through damage on your opponents. Meanwhile, Redeem Through Fire is probably something that I would expect to use almost every turn, because any operative that has a blaze weapon, which is pretty much the entire team barring a couple melee operatives, will put a blaze token on all enemies within 2 inches when incapacitated. That is just crazy. You do need to be visible. However, 2 inches explosion for guaranteed D3 damage that can either taxes your opponent on another APL, or you could do 2 D3 damage. It's just crazy efficient for 1 CP, especially in a 2-inch bubble. Unwavering Devotion is our last ploy. It's the bodyguard ploy that works on the Orator or the Miraculous, and by Orator I mean the Confessor or whoever picks up the role afterwards. Neither of those two can jump in front of anyone else, but considering that the Death Cult Assassin exists and he probably wants to sit around 3 inches of either your Confessor or your Miraculous, you can force your opponent into really awkward fights. Meanwhile, on our equipment, we've got a couple good choices. The first one, not the most interesting. Sanctification Orbs is basically a chance every turn for you to throw a jar of oil, and if you do a jar of oil on your opponent, you get Seek. which sounds good. However, there are a couple considerations. Your Cherub, Death Cult Assassin, and Miraculous cannot do this, which means it's got to be one of your normal guys. They probably need a third APL, or they need to do some other stuff. So there's a lot of conditions. It is powerful, but if you just take your Conflagrator guy, he just has it out of the box, which seems, a little better. Meanwhile, Purity Seals feels like an auto take for me. If you miss 2 dice, you can convert one of them to a hit by throwing away a failure once a turn. Because you hit on 4s in melee or 3s in melee, it's probably nice to have a little bit of reliability, especially on Blaze tokens. And then for Ecclesiarchal Text, this is a must take. Every turning point that you have in order, which means that generally on turning point 1, it's not possible to have an order. You're going to roll 2d6 and roll under their wounds to get 1 CP. So because our Confessor has 10 wounds, you're going to roll a 9 or under, which is a pretty high chance. It's not impossible, and it's the current number of wounds. So if your Confessor takes damage, this is a little bit harder to trigger. But it also seems like pretty much free CP, and that's has been good generically throughout the entirety of this edition and last edition. Meanwhile, Imperial Cult Symbols are a nice little tech piece. You can downgrade 1 shooting critical dice to a normal dice once a turn. If you expect to get shot at a lot, this is pretty solid. It doesn't stop retain critical hit rules, so piercing crits 1 or melt mortal wounds are not affected by Imperial Cult Symbols. Still, a nice addition to reliability, especially when you consider that the Rosarius can take that normal crit dice and turn, or that normal die, and just ignore it. So if you get attacked by a crack grenade or something else without lethal rules, you can do a lot with Imperial Cult Symbols. Overall thoughts. I'm not going to lie here. The potential for 14-inch charge on turn 1, especially on teams that you're out-activating, means that your Preachers and all the other stuff that's out-activating your opponent, definitely going to put a crimp on a lot of people's style. I think, especially against Eldar teams or any of these frail 8-wound teams, this team is going to put a little bit of a stop on them. The mobility and the defensive profiles definitely remind me of the worst play patterns of both the Pathfinders at the beginning of their release and the Imperial Navy Breachers as far as the defensive wounds. Effectively, if you do enough of the bubble juggling, you can have 4-up saves with -1 hit damage that you can also shunt up the field 12 inches, and your opponent can't really interact with any of those things. However, with that said, because you have to juggle all of these bubbles, if you don't do any of them, your opponent can just pick apart your team one by one, and because you have to stay in a bunch of 6-inch bubbles, there's also a chance that you give your opponent a lot more double charges than you would otherwise. Blaze tokens are also another hidden power. As anyone who's played against Plague Marines would know, anytime that you have to activate an operative, take a poison, and die, that's a nightmare. And because Blaze tokens are so much easier to find on this team, that's going to happen probably a little bit more, and because it's doing D3 damage, it could definitely happen, especially against 8-wound teams, 7-wound teams, and even on some of the 10-wound teams. Like the core box matchup between Goremongers and the Sanctifiers, anytime that you land 8 damage on your opponent and then drop a Blaze token on them, it's basically a 50-50 on whether or not they survive, which is kind of a nightmare. I do expect that this is more of a 2-box team rather than a 1-box team. I think if you build the box with all of the specialists, it's probably not going to be as good as having a couple Preachers, because that extra sermon range is just crazy nice. Anyways, thanks guys for stopping by this review. Hope you guys enjoyed the footage, enjoyed the review, and go check out Jason's. And if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, please subscribe, and thank you for making it to the end.